Heart's Reckoning.
France, 1918.
Elise Bertrand, tending to wounded soldiers, heard a soft voice in the chaos mutter her name, while muddy ground revealed the freshly inscribed Corporal Lucien Dubois. Chapter 1. A Whisper in the Deluge. The rain was a relentless, drumming curtain, turning the already churned earth of the field hospital into a sucking, clinging mire. Elise Bertrand, her hands raw and chapped, barely registered the cold seeping through her worn boots. Her focus, absolute and unwavering, was on the young soldier before her, his face pale and drawn, a crimson stain blossoming across the rough fabric of his uniform. Another life, another thread threatening to snap in this tapestry of unending war. "Hold still, mon chéri," she murmured, her voice hoarse from days of shouting over the din of artillery and the cries of the wounded. Just a little longer. The soldier, barely more than a boy, gritted his teeth, his eyes squeezed shut against the pain as she probed the ragged edges of the shrapnel wound. Around them, the air was thick with the cloying sweetness of blood and the acrid tang of antiseptic. The makeshift hospital, a cluster of tents hastily erected near the front lines, offered little protection from the elements, let alone the relentless barrage of German shells. A sudden, ear-splitting crack nearby sent a tremor through the ground, showering them with mud and debris. Elise instinctively shielded the boy with her body, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd grown accustomed to the constant threat, the ever-present shadow of death, but the fear never truly faded. It lingered, a cold knot in her stomach, a constant reminder of the fragility of life in this godforsaken place. When the dust settled, she returned to her task, her hands surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her heart. She worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound, applying a bandage, murmuring soothing words she wasn't sure the boy even heard. He was losing too much blood. She knew it, even without the grim pronouncements of the harried doctors who rushed from tent to tent, their faces etched with fatigue and despair. As she finished, another wave of wounded arrived, carried on stretchers, their bodies broken and bleeding. The sheer volume was overwhelming, a relentless tide of human suffering that threatened to drown them all. Elise moved mechanically, triaging, bandaging, offering what small comfort she could in this maelstrom of pain. It was amidst this chaos, a lull between one wave of casualties and the next, that she heard it. A whisper, so faint she almost dismissed it as a trick of the wind, a phantom sound in the cacophony of war.
Elise.
She froze, her hand hovering over a roll of bandages. She looked around, her eyes scanning the rows of cots, the faces blurred by pain and exhaustion. No one seemed to have spoken. The only sounds were the moans of the injured, the rhythmic drumming of the rain, and the distant rumble of artillery. She shook her head, dismissing it. Fatigue, she thought. She was hearing things. She'd been working for nearly 36 hours straight, fueled by nothing but weak coffee and the adrenaline that surged through her veins with each new arrival. Then she saw it. Scratched into the mud-caked floor of the tent, near the entrance, barely visible beneath the constant trample of boots, were two words, Corporal Lucien Dubois. The name, crudely etched, resonated through her with an unexpected force. Lucien. A name from a lifetime ago, a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, a name she had tried, and failed, to bury beneath the weight of duty and loss. She knelt, her fingers tracing the letters, the cold mud seeping through the thin fabric of her skirt.
It couldn't be. He was gone. Lost.
Like so many others, swallowed by the insatiable maw of this war. The official telegram had arrived 2 years ago, stark and impersonal, informing her of his death in the trenches near Verdun. She had mourned him, grieved him, built a wall around her heart to protect herself from the unbearable pain of his absence. And yet here was his name, a whisper from the grave, a ghost in the deluge. A fresh wave of wounded arrived, breaking her reverie. She rose, her mind reeling, the whisper and the name echoing in her mind. Duty called, and she pushed the unsettling discovery to the back of her mind, immersing herself once more in the relentless rhythm of the hospital. But the seed of doubt, of hope, had been planted. It took hold.
And grew.
The image of the name in the mud, Lucien's name, refused to fade. Chapter 2. The Ghost of Eris. The night shift brought a different kind of torment. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a chilling mist that clung to everything, seeping into the tents, dampening spirits already worn thin. The sounds of the battlefield were muted, replaced by the low groans of men wrestling with pain and the occasional, sharp cry that pierced the stillness. Elise moved among them, a shadow flitting through the dimly lit tents, offering water, adjusting bandages, whispering words of comfort. Her thoughts, however, were far from the immediate suffering surrounding her. They were trapped in a swirling vortex of memory and disbelief, centered on the name scratched in the mud. Corporal Lucien Dubois. Could it truly be him? The logical part of her mind, the part honed by years of witnessing the brutal realities of war, dismissed it as impossible.
He was dead.
She had seen the telegram, felt the crushing weight of finality. Yet a small, persistent voice, a flicker of hope she thought long extinguished, refused to be silenced. It whispered of miracles, of mistaken identities, of the countless stories of soldiers returning from the brink, their bodies and minds scarred, but their spirits unbroken. She found herself searching the faces of the wounded, a desperate, almost frantic need to find a familiar feature, a spark of recognition. Each new arrival brought a fresh surge of anticipation, followed by the inevitable crushing disappointment. During a brief lull, she sought out Madame Dubois, no relation. She thought he often joked that half of France shared the same name, and how would she ever find him amongst them all? The head nurse, a woman whose stern demeanor hid a heart worn raw by the constant stream of casualties. Madame Dubois had been at the hospital since the beginning of the war, her knowledge of the soldiers passing through its tents encyclopedic. Madame Dubois, Elise began, her voice hesitant. Do you recall, by any chance, a Corporal Lucien Dubois? He would have been here, perhaps, earlier today? Madame Dubois looked at her, her eyes, ringed with fatigue, narrowed in thought. She ran a hand through her graying hair, pulled back in a severe bun. Dubois. The name is common, you know. We've had dozens, perhaps hundreds, pass through these tents. Elise's heart sank. Of course. It was a foolish hope, a desperate grasp at straws. This one, he would have been wounded, possibly severely, Elise pressed, a tremor in her voice. He might have mentioned my name. Elise Bertrand. Madame Dubois paused, her gaze sharpening. She studied Elise's face, her expression unreadable. Bertrand. There was a soldier earlier today. Badly wounded. Shrapnel to the chest and abdomen. He was delirious, muttering, but I don't recall the name Dubois. Elise's breath caught in her throat. What name did he mutter? Madame Dubois hesitated. He kept repeating a woman's name. It sounded like Elodie. Yes, Elodie. He was calling for Elodie. Elise felt a cold wave of disappointment wash over her. Elodie. Not Elise. It wasn't him. It was just another cruel trick of fate, another phantom conjured by her exhaustion and her desperate longing. He was sent to the field hospital near Arras. Madame Dubois continued, her voice softening slightly. It's a larger facility, better equipped to handle severe cases. If he survived the journey. Arras. The name resonated with a chilling familiarity. It was near Arras that Lucien had been stationed before the telegram. A wave of nausea swept over Elise. It was a coincidence, nothing more. Thank you, Madame Dubois, Elise managed, her voice barely a whisper. She turned away, her shoulders slumping, the weight of her disappointment crushing her. As she walked back to her duties, a thought struck her. Elodie. Lucien had never mentioned an Elodie. In all their letters, all their whispered conversations before the war, he had never spoken of another woman. It was always Elise, only Elise. The insistent flicker of hope rekindled, fueled by this new, unsettling detail. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Elise moved through the motions, tending to the wounded, her mind a battlefield of its own. The name, the whisper, the discrepancy, it all swirled within her, a puzzle she couldn't ignore, a ghost she couldn't lay to rest. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky a pale, washed-out gray, she knew what she had to do. She had to go to Eris. Even if it was a fool's errand, even if it meant facing the crushing reality of his death once more, she had to know the truth. The uncertainty was a torment far worse than any definitive answer. The not knowing had to end, whatever the cost. Chapter 3. Letters from a Stranger. The journey to Eris was a bleak reflection of the war-torn landscape. Fields that once bloomed with vibrant life were now scarred and barren, pockmarked with shell craters, the earth churned into a muddy, desolate wasteland. Villages lay in ruins, their buildings reduced to skeletal remains, their inhabitants scattered or dead. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a constant reminder of the war's relentless toll. Elise secured passage on a supply truck, crammed amongst crates of medical supplies and ammunition. The journey was arduous, the road bumpy and uneven, the constant jolting a painful reminder of the fragility of the human body. She sat huddled in a corner, clutching a small, worn leather pouch that held all her worldly possessions, including the few precious letters Lucien had managed to send her before his supposed death. She pulled out the letters, their edges frayed and softened with repeated readings. The ink was faded in places, the handwriting a bold, confident script reflecting the man she remembered. She traced the words with her fingertip, each sentence a portal to a time before the war, a time of stolen kisses in moonlit gardens, of whispered promises and shared dreams. His words were filled with love, with longing, with a fierce determination to return to her. He wrote of the horrors of the trenches, the constant fear, the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, but always, his letters ended with a declaration of his unwavering love for her, his Belle Elise. He never mentioned an Elodie. The discrepancy gnawed at her. Could he have had another life, a secret he had kept hidden from her? The thought was a bitter pill to swallow, a betrayal of the trust they had shared. Yet, she couldn't dismiss it entirely. War changed people, broke them, twisted them into shapes they barely recognized themselves. As the truck rumbled on, a new thought emerged, even more unsettling than the possibility of another woman. What if the soldier in Eris wasn't Lucien at all? What if it was someone who had somehow obtained his belongings, his letters, and was using his identity for some unknown purpose? Espionage was rampant, the lines between friend and foe blurred in the fog of war. She remembered stories of soldiers assuming the identities of fallen comrades to escape the horrors of the front, to desert, to start new lives. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Was she chasing a ghost? Or worse, a deliberate deception? The truck finally arrived at the outskirts of Eris, the city bearing the scars of heavy fighting. Buildings were reduced to rubble, the streets littered with debris. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of explosives. The field hospital was located in a partially destroyed school, its windows boarded up, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes. Elise approached the entrance with trepidation, her heart pounding in her chest. A harried-looking medical orderly directed her to a large, makeshift ward, filled with rows of cots, each occupied by a wounded soldier. The air was heavy with the sounds of suffering, the moans of men in pain, the labored breathing of those clinging to life. She walked slowly down the rows, her eyes scanning the faces, searching for a flicker of recognition. Each face was a mask of pain, their features blurred by bandages and exhaustion. She felt a growing sense of despair, the realization that her journey might have been in vain. Then she saw him. He was lying on a cot near the far end of the ward, his body swathed in bandages, his face pale and gaunt. But even through the layers of gauze and the ravages of injury, she recognized him. The shape of his jaw, the curve of his brow, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, it was Lucien. She rushed to his side, her heart overflowing with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He was alive. Against all odds, he was alive. But as she drew closer, She saw that his eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. A young nurse, her face etched with concern, was attending to him.
Lucien?
Elise whispered, her voice trembling. The nurse looked up, her expression grim. He's been unconscious since they brought him in. He's lost a lot of blood. The doctors, they don't give him much chance. Elise knelt beside the cot, her hand reaching out to touch his. His skin was cold, clammy. She gently took his hand in hers, her fingers interlacing with his. Lucien, she whispered again, her voice choked with emotion. It's me, Elise. I'm here. There was no response. His eyes remained closed, his breathing unchanged. But as she held his hand, she felt a faint pressure, a barely perceptible squeeze. It was a flicker of life, a sign that he was still fighting. And in that moment, Elise knew that she would fight with him. She would stay by his side, whispering words of love and encouragement, willing him to return to her. She would not let him go. Not again. The faint squeeze of his hand, however small, was everything. Chapter 4. The Serpent in the Sanctuary. Days bled into nights, marked only by the changing of shifts and the rhythmic rise and fall of Lucien's chest. Elise remained a constant presence at his bedside, a silent sentinel in the bustling ward. She spoke to him, read to him from his old letters, sang the songs they used to share, even though he remained unresponsive, lost in the twilight world between life and death. The nurses, initially skeptical of her unwavering devotion, gradually came to accept her presence, even offering small acts of kindness, a cup of weak tea, a blanket to ward off the chill, a few moments of respite. They saw in her a reflection of their own hopes and fears, a testament to the enduring power of love in the face of unimaginable loss. Elise learned more about Lucien's condition. The shrapnel had caused severe internal injuries, and infection had set in, complicating his recovery. The doctors were pessimistic, their words veiled in medical jargon but their meaning unmistakable. He was slipping away. But Elise refused to give up hope. She clung to the memory of that faint squeeze of his hand, the whisper of his name in the deluge, the unwavering love that had sustained her through the darkest years of the war. She believed in miracles, in the resilience of the human spirit, in the power of love to transcend even death. One evening, as she sat beside Lucien, holding his hand, she noticed a small, intricately carved wooden box tucked beneath his pillow. It was unfamiliar, not something she had ever seen before. Curiosity and a growing sense of unease prompted her to examine it. The box was locked, but she found a small key hidden amongst the bandages on his chest. With trembling hands, she opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photograph was of a woman, young and strikingly beautiful, with dark, piercing eyes and a cascade of raven hair. It wasn't Elise. It was the woman Lucien had called for in his delirium. Elodie. Elise felt a sharp pang of jealousy, a visceral reaction to this tangible proof of another woman in Lucien's life. But as she looked closer, she noticed something unsettling about the woman's expression. It wasn't the soft, loving gaze of a lover, but something colder, more calculating. She unfolded the piece of paper. It was a letter, written in a neat, precise hand, entirely in German. Elise's heart sank. She couldn't read German, but the very presence of the letter, coupled with a photograph, sent a shiver of dread through her. She carefully placed the letter and photograph back in the box and locked it, replacing it beneath Lucien's pillow. She needed to find someone who could translate the letter, someone she could trust. But in this place of shifting alliances and hidden agendas, who could she turn to? The next day, she sought out Father Michel, the hospital chaplain, a kind, elderly man who had offered her solace and quiet wisdom in her darkest hours. She showed him the box and its contents, her voice trembling as she explained her fears. Father Michel examined the letter carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. After a long silence, he looked at Elise, his expression grave. "This letter, is not what you think, Elise," he said slowly. "It is not a love letter. It is a message from a German intelligence officer. Elise felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. What does it say? It speaks of a mission, a rendezvous, a betrayal, Father Michel said, his voice barely above a whisper. It mentions a code name, Nightingale. And it ends with a threat, a warning that if the mission fails, Nightingale will be exposed and eliminated. Elise stared at him, her mind reeling. Lucien de spy? A traitor? It was impossible. He was a soldier, a patriot, a man who loved his country, his belle Elise. He would never betray France. There must be some mistake, she said, her voice shaking. Lucien, he would never. I pray that you are right, my child, Father Michel said, his eyes filled with compassion. But this letter, is damning. And this woman, Elodie, she is known to us. She is a German agent, a dangerous woman who has seduced and betrayed many French officers. Elise felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. The serpent had entered their sanctuary, their fragile world of hope and love, threatening to destroy everything. She had to find out the truth, to clear Lucien's name, to expose the real traitor.
But how?
And who could she trust? The very walls seemed to whisper secrets, and danger lurked in every shadow. The letter was a key, and the key opened a door to something terrible. Chapter 5. Scars of the Somme. The revelation of the letter's contents cast a long, dark shadow over Elise's already precarious world. Lucien, a German spy? The thought was a knife twisting in her gut, a betrayal of everything she believed in, everything she held dear. Yet, the evidence, however circumstantial, was undeniable. The letter, the photograph, Elodie's reputation, all pointed to a truth she desperately didn't want to believe. She spent the next few days in a state of agonizing uncertainty, torn between her unwavering love for Lucien and the growing suspicion that he was not the man she thought he was. She continued to visit him, to hold his hand, to whisper words of encouragement, but a cold, hard knot of doubt had taken root in her heart. She avoided Father Michel, unable to face the pity in his eyes, the unspoken judgment. She couldn't bear to hear him confirm her worst fears, to shatter the fragile illusion of hope she had so desperately clung to. One afternoon, as she sat beside Lucien, she noticed a change in his condition. His breathing was more labored, his fever higher. The nurses were frantic, their faces grim. The infection was spreading, and they were losing the battle to save him. Elise felt a surge of panic, a desperate need to reach him, to break through the wall of unconsciousness that separated them. She leaned close, her lips brushing against his ear. Lucien, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Please, you have to fight. You have to come back to me. I need you. She continued to speak to him, pouring out her heart, her fears, her doubts, her unwavering love. She told him about the letter, about Elodie, about the accusations of espionage. She begged him to wake up, to explain, to tell her it wasn't true. As she spoke, she felt a faint movement in his hand, a slight pressure against hers. She looked down, her heart pounding. His eyes were still closed, but his fingers were tightening around hers, a clear, deliberate response. Lucien? She whispered, her voice trembling with hope.
Can you hear me?
His eyes flickered open, just for a moment, a sliver of recognition in their depths. He tried to speak, but only a faint, guttural sound escaped his lips. Elodie, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Elise felt a stab of pain, a confirmation of her worst fears. He was thinking of her, the German agent, even in his delirium. But then he spoke again, his voice stronger, clearer. Elodie, betrayal, Nightingale. He squeezed her hand again, his eyes pleading with her to understand. And then his grip loosened, his eyes closed, and he slipped back into unconsciousness. Elise sat there, stunned, his words echoing in her mind. Elodie, betrayal, Nightingale. He wasn't confessing, he was warning her. He was trying to tell her something crucial, something that could save him, and perhaps even save France. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Lucien wasn't a spy, he was Nightingale, the code name mentioned in the letter. He was working undercover, infiltrating the German intelligence network, risking his life to gather information for France. Elodie was his contact, his lover, perhaps, but also his enemy, a woman who had betrayed him, exposed him. A wave of relief washed over Elise, followed by a surge of determination. She had to find out the truth, to clear Lucien's name, to expose Elodie's treachery. She had to finish what he had started. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, someone she could trust, someone with knowledge of the shadowy world of espionage. She thought of Madame Dubois, the head nurse, her stern demeanor, her encyclopedic knowledge of the soldiers passing through the hospital. She remembered Madame Dubois's sharp gaze, the way she had studied Elise's face when she had asked about Lucien. Elise decided to take a risk. She sought out Madame Dubois, finding her in her small, cluttered office, poring over medical records. Madame Dubois, Elise began, her voice hesitant, "I need your help. It's about Corporal Dubois, not about Lucien." Madame Dubois looked up, her expression unreadable. "What about him?" Elise took a deep breath and told her everything. She showed her the wooden box, the photograph, the translation of the letter. She explained her suspicions, her fears, her belief that Lucien was innocent. Madame Dubois listened in silence, her eyes fixed on Elise's face. When Elise finished, Madame Dubois leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "I knew there was something about that boy," she said finally, her voice low. "Something that didn't quite add up. He was too quiet, too observant. And he asked too many questions." Elise's heart sank. Was Madame Dubois going to betray her, turn her in to the authorities? But then, Madame Dubois smiled, a rare, fleeting smile that transformed her stern features. "I've been working for the French resistance since the beginning of the war," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I believe you, Elise. I believe Lucien is innocent. And I believe we can save him." The scars of the Somme, both visible and hidden, were beginning to tell their story. Chapter 6. The Nightingale's Lament. Madame Dubois, beneath her guise of a battle-hardened nurse, was a linchpin in a clandestine network that stretched from the muddy trenches to the gilded halls of Paris. Her revelation was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the murky waters of espionage and betrayal. "We need to find out what Lucien knew," Madame Dubois said, her voice firm, her eyes sharp and focused. "What information was he trying to pass on? And who was he working with?" Elise nodded, her mind racing. The letter mentioned a rendezvous. And a threat if the mission failed. "We need to find that rendezvous point," Madame Dubois said. "And we need to find out who Elodie was working with. She may have been a double agent, but she was also a pawn in a larger game." Madame Dubois revealed a hidden compartment behind a stack of medical records, revealing a small, wireless radio. "This is how I communicate with my contacts," she explained. "We'll use it to send a message, to alert them to Lucien's situation, to ask for their help." Elise watched in amazement as Madame Dubois expertly tapped out a coded message, her fingers flying across the keys. The air crackled with static, the only sound in the small, cluttered office. "Now we wait," Madame Dubois said, her expression grim. "But we don't have much time. Lucien's condition is deteriorating. And if Elodie's allies discover that he's still alive, they'll finish what they started." Elise returned to Lucien's bedside, her heart heavy with a mixture of hope and fear. She held his hand, whispering words of encouragement, willing him to hold on. She studied his face, searching for any sign of improvement, any flicker of consciousness. As she sat there, she remembered something Lucien had told her, a story from his childhood, a song he used to sing with his grandmother. It was a folk song, a lament about a nightingale, trapped in a cage, its wings clipped, its song silenced. She began to sing the song, her voice soft and trembling, the melody filling the quiet ward. She sang of the nightingale's longing for freedom, its yearning for the open sky, its unwavering spirit. As she sang, she felt a faint pressure on her hand. She looked down, her heart leaping with hope. Lucien's eyes were open, his gaze fixed on her face.
Elise.
He whispered, his voice weak but clear. Lucien, you're awake. She cried, tears streaming down her face. He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that lit up his gaunt features. I heard you singing. I'm here, Lucien, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I'm here. And I know everything. I know about Elodie, about Nightingale. You're not a traitor, Lucien. You're a hero. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. They know. He whispered. The rendezvous at the church, Sainte-Chapelle.
Sainte-Chapelle?
Elise repeated, her mind racing. Sainte-Chapelle, the beautiful, Gothic chapel in Paris, known for its stunning stained glass windows. What was the connection? The stained glass to the rose window. Lucien whispered, his voice fading. The message is hidden there. He squeezed her hand one last time, and then his grip loosened, his eyes closed, and he slipped back into unconsciousness. Elise sat there, stunned, his words echoing in her mind. The rose window Sainte-Chapelle, the message, it was a puzzle, a riddle wrapped in a mystery, shrouded in the dangers of war. But she knew what she had to do. She had to go to Paris. She had to find the message, to unravel the secrets hidden within the stained glass, to expose the truth and clear Lucien's name. The Nightingale's lament had become her own, a song of love, loss, and a desperate fight for freedom. And it had led her to Paris, the city of lights, now shrouded in the darkness of war. The message was hidden in plain sight, in a place of beauty and worship, transformed into a key piece of a deadly puzzle. Chapter 7. A Dance in the Ruins. Paris, even under the shadow of war, retained a defiant elegance. The grand boulevards, though less crowded, still pulsed with a muted energy. The cafes, though offering meager fare, still provided a semblance of normalcy. But beneath the surface, the city was a nervous, watchful entity, its citizens living under the constant threat of occupation, betrayal, and the ever-present fear of the enemy. Elise, disguised as a Red Cross volunteer, arrived in Paris with the help of Madame Dubois's contacts. She carried with her the small wooden box, Lucien's last words echoing in her mind, Sainte-Chapelle, the rose window, the message. She made her way to the Isle de la site, the heart of Paris, where Sainte-Chapelle stood, a jewel of Gothic architecture, its spire reaching towards the heavens. The chapel, though damaged by earlier bombings, still retained its breathtaking beauty, its stained glass windows a kaleidoscope of color and light. Elise entered the chapel, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was cool and still, the only sound the faint echo of her footsteps on the stone floor. She gazed up at the rose window, a magnificent circular masterpiece depicting scenes from the apocalypse, its intricate details a testament to the skill of its creators. But which window? There were several rose windows, each a dazzling display of artistry. And where was the message? How was it hidden? She spent hours studying the windows, searching for any clue, any anomaly, any sign that might reveal the secret Lucien had risked his life to protect. She examined the figures, the symbols, the colors, her eyes scanning every inch of the intricate designs. As dusk began to fall, casting long shadows across the chapel floor, she felt a growing sense of despair. She had found nothing. The message, if it existed at all, remained elusive. She sat down on a wooden pew, her head in her hands, her spirit flagging. She was about to give up, to admit defeat, when she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, almost imperceptible inscription etched into the stone frame of one of the smaller rose windows, depicting the scene of the Last Judgment. The inscription was in Latin, a series of numbers and letters, seemingly random, a code. Elise recognized it instantly. It was a cipher, a method of encrypting messages, one that Lucien had taught her during their courtship, a secret language they had shared. Her heart leaped with hope. She quickly copied the inscription into a small notebook she carried, her hand trembling with excitement. She knew she couldn't decipher the code here in the open. She needed a safe place, somewhere she could work without fear of being observed. As she was leaving the chapel, she noticed a small, unassuming cafe across the street, its windows darkened, its door slightly ajar. A sign above the door read, "Le Chat Noir the Black Cat." It seemed deserted, abandoned, a relic of a bygone era. Intrigued, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cafe was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of stale tobacco and dust. Tables and chairs were scattered haphazardly, covered in a layer of grime. It looked as though it hadn't been used in months, perhaps years. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw a figure sitting at a table in the back, silhouetted against the faint glow of a single candle. A man, dressed in the uniform of a French officer, his face hidden in shadow. "Can I help you, mademoiselle?" the man asked, his voice low and smooth. Elise hesitated, her instincts warning her of danger. But she had nowhere else to go, and she was running out of time. I need a place to work," she said, her voice trembling. "Somewhere private. Somewhere safe." The man studied her for a moment, his eyes piercing the gloom. "What kind of work?" Elise took a deep breath. "I have a message, a code, that needs to be deciphered. It's a matter of life and death." The man smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I believe I can help you with that, mademoiselle. I am Captain Dubois."
Antoine Dubois.
He stood, and as the candlelight flickered on his face, she froze. He bore a striking resemblance to Lucien, only older, harder. "And I believe you must be working with my brother, Lucien." It was a denouement and the start of a new, dangerous alliance. He had been expecting her, or someone like her. Chapter 8. The Weight of Whispers. The revelation of Antoine's identity sent a wave of conflicting emotions through Elise. Relief that she wasn't alone, that Lucien had family who could help. Suspicion that this man, despite his resemblance to Lucien, might be part of the conspiracy. And fear that she was walking into a trap, a carefully laid snare set by Elodie and her allies. How did you know?" Elise asked, her voice barely a whisper. Antoine gestured to a chair. "Please, sit down, Mademoiselle Bertrand. We have much to discuss." Elise hesitated, then cautiously sat down opposite him. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating Antoine's face. He was older than Lucien, his features sharper, his eyes harder, bearing the weight of experience and, perhaps, betrayal. "Lucien sent a message, weeks ago," Antoine explained, his voice low and guarded. "A coded message, intercepted by our network. He warned us that he was being compromised, that his cover was blown. He mentioned a woman, Elodie." Elise nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "He told me about her. He said she betrayed him." "She did," Antoine confirmed, his voice grim. "She was a double agent, working for both sides, playing us against each other. But she was also ambitious, greedy. She wanted more than just money. She wanted power." "And the message in Saint-Chapelle?" Elise asked. "Lucien discovered that Elodie was planning to deliver vital information to the Germans," Antoine said. "Information that could change the course of the war. The location of our troop deployments, our supply lines, our strategic plans, everything." "And he hid that information in the rose window?" "Yes," Antoine confirmed. "He used a complex cipher, one that only he and I knew. He knew that if he was captured, if he was killed, the information would be safe, hidden in plain sight, until someone could retrieve it." Elise pulled out the notebook and showed Antoine the inscription she had copied from the window frame. He examined it carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is it," he said finally. "This is the key to the cipher. But we need time to decipher it. It's a complex code, and it will take hours, perhaps days, to unravel." "We don't have days," Elise said, her voice urgent. "Lucien is dying. And if Elodie's allies discover that he's still alive, they'll finish what they started. We need to get that information to the French High Command before it's too late." Antoine nodded, his expression grim. "You're right. We need to work quickly. And we need to be careful. Elodie's network is extensive, and they have eyes and ears everywhere. He stood up and walked to the back of the cafe, disappearing behind a heavy curtain. Elise heard the sound of a lock clicking, a door opening. He returned a few moments later, carrying a small, leather-bound book. "This is the cipher book," he explained. "It contains the key to the code. With this and the inscription you copied, we can decipher the message." He sat down opposite her and opened the book. The pages were filled with intricate symbols, diagrams, and equations. It was a complex, almost impenetrable system designed to protect secrets from prying eyes. They began to work, their heads bent close together. The only sound the scratching of their pens on paper, the occasional rustle of the pages, the faint crackle of the candle. The weight of whispers, of secrets, of lives hanging in the balance, pressed down on them, a heavy burden in the dimly lit cafe. The fate of Lucien, of France, perhaps even of the war, rested on their ability to unlock the secrets hidden within the code. The silence of the abandoned cafe was filled with the intensity of their task. The air was heavy, charged. Chapter 9. Echoes of Betrayal. Hours passed in the dimly lit cafe, the silence broken only by the scratching of pens and the occasional whispered consultation between Elise and Antoine. The cipher was proving to be even more complex than they had anticipated, a labyrinth of intricate symbols and misleading clues. As they worked, Antoine shared more about Lucien's past, his training as an intelligence officer, his unwavering dedication to France. He spoke of Lucien's courage, his resourcefulness, his ability to blend in, to become someone else, to infiltrate the enemy's ranks. He was always a risk-taker, Antoine said, a hint of pride in his voice. He believed in what he was doing, in fighting for what was right, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Elise listened, her heart aching for the man she loved, the man she thought she knew, the man who had hidden so much from her, even as he professed his love. She understood now the weight of his burden, the constant fear, the loneliness of his mission. "He never mentioned Elodie," Elise said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "He never told me about her."
Antoine sighed.
"He couldn't. It was too dangerous. He had to protect you, to keep you safe. And he had to maintain his cover. Elodie was his contact, his lover, perhaps, but also his enemy. It was a dangerous game, and he knew the risks. But why did she betray him?"
Elise asked.
"What did she gain?" "Power," Antoine said, his voice grim. "She was ambitious, ruthless. She wanted to control the flow of information, to manipulate both sides, to become a player in the game of war." As they continued to work, they began to unravel the layers of the cipher, slowly piecing together the fragments of the message. The information Lucien had hidden was even more devastating than they had feared. It detailed a planned German offensive, a massive assault designed to break through the French lines and capture Paris. The attack was imminent, scheduled to begin within days. If the information reached the French high command in time, they could prepare, reinforce their defenses, and perhaps avert a catastrophic defeat. But if the Germans launched their attack before the French were ready, the consequences would be disastrous. Elise felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate need to act, to warn the authorities, to prevent the impending disaster. But Antoine cautioned her against haste. "We can't just rush to the high command with this information," he said. "Elodie's network is extensive. They have spies everywhere, even within the military. We need to be careful, to find someone we can trust, someone who can get the information to the right people, without alerting the enemy." He paused, his gaze fixed on Elise's face. "There's someone a contact of mine, a high-ranking officer in the French military, General Dubois." Elise was stunned. "Another Dubois?" He nodded. "My uncle. He and Lucien's father were brothers. He's been instrumental in the resistance since the beginning. He can be trusted. But how do we reach him?" Elise asked. "Paris is crawling with German spies. It's too dangerous."
Antoine smiled, a fin, knowing smile.
"There's a way. A secret passage, an underground network used by the resistance to move people and information undetected. It's risky, but it's our only chance." He led her to the back of the cafe, to a hidden door concealed behind a stack of empty wine crates. He opened the door, revealing a narrow, dark staircase leading down into the depths of the earth. This passage leads to a network of tunnels that runs beneath the city, Antoine explained. It's a maze, a labyrinth, but I know the way. We'll use it to reach my uncle, to deliver the message. Elise hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. The thought of venturing into the dark, unknown tunnels was terrifying. But she knew she had no choice. She had to trust Antoine, to follow him into the depths, to face the dangers that awaited them. The echoes of betrayal, of Lucien's sacrifice, of the impending attack, propelled her forward. The weight of their secret, of their mission, rested heavily on their shoulders as they descended into the darkness. The passage was their only way, and it was fraught with the unknown. Chapter 10. The Poppy Field Secret. The air in the underground passage was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of earth and decay. The only light came from the flickering flame of Antoine's lantern, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the drip of water and the sound of their footsteps echoing through the narrow tunnels. Elise followed closely behind Antoine, her senses on high alert. She felt a growing sense of unease, a primal fear of the unknown, of the darkness that surrounded them. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, a labyrinth designed to confuse and disorient. How much further? Elise asked, her voice barely a whisper. Not far, Antoine replied, his voice calm and reassuring. We're nearing the rendezvous point. It's an old abandoned cellar beneath a ruined building near the outskirts of the city. As they walked, Antoine spoke of the resistance, of the brave men and women who risked their lives daily to fight the German occupation. He told her stories of sabotage, of daring rescues, of secret meetings held in the shadows, of the constant threat of discovery and death. Elise listened, her admiration for these unsung heroes growing with each word. She realized that she was now a part of this hidden world, this secret war, a world where trust was a precious commodity and betrayal a constant threat. They reached a section of the tunnel that had partially collapsed, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees through a narrow opening. The air was thick with dust, making it difficult to breathe. Elise felt a wave of claustrophobia, a desperate need to escape the confines of the underground passage. As they emerged from the narrow opening, they found themselves in a large, vaulted cellar, its walls lined with empty wine racks, its floor covered in debris. The air was stale and musty, the silence deafening. This is it, Antoine said, his voice hushed. This is where we meet my uncle. He placed the lantern on a broken crate and looked around, his eyes scanning the shadows. The cellar was empty, deserted. There was no sign of General Dubois. He should be here, Antoine said, his voice tinged with concern. He's always punctual. Elise felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Something was wrong. The silence, the emptiness, the absence of General Dubois, it all pointed to a trap, a carefully laid ambush. Suddenly, they heard a noise, a faint scraping sound coming from the far end of the cellar. Antoine quickly extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness. Stay here, he whispered, his voice urgent. And don't make a sound. He moved silently towards the source of the noise, disappearing into the shadows. Elise remained where she was, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses straining to detect any sign of movement, any hint of danger. The silence stretched on, an eternity of waiting, of fear, of uncertainty. Then, she heard a muffled cry, a scuffle, the sound of bodies struggling. She wanted to rush to Antoine's aid, but she knew she couldn't. She had to stay hidden, to protect the message, to fulfill her mission. After what seemed like an eternity, the sounds of struggle ceased. Elise waited, her breath held, her body tense. Then, she heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. A figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted against the faint light filtering through a crack in the cellar wall. It was Antoine, his face bruised and bloodied, his clothes torn. We have to go, he said, his voice urgent.
Now.
It was a trap. They were waiting for us. He grabbed her hand and pulled her towards a hidden door in the back of the cellar, a secret exit known only to the resistance. As they ran, Elise asked, "Your uncle?" Antoine shook his head, grimly.
Captured.
Or worse. They emerged from the cellar into a deserted alleyway, the night air cold and crisp on their faces. They ran, their footsteps echoing through the empty streets, the threat of pursuit a constant presence. They were fugitives, hunted by both the Germans and Elodie's network, their only hope the poppy field, where the true secret lay hidden, not in the coded message itself, but in its ultimate destination, a destination only General Dubois knew. The race was on, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 11. Beneath a Sky of Fire. They ran through the labyrinthine streets of Paris, their pursuers hot on their heels. Gunshots echoed in the distance, a stark reminder of the danger they faced. Antoine, despite his injuries, moved with a surprising agility, guiding Elise through the maze of alleyways and back streets, his knowledge of the city's hidden passages their only advantage. "We need to get out of the city," Antoine said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "They'll be searching for us everywhere. We need to reach the countryside, to find a safe haven." Elise nodded, her own lungs burning, her legs aching. She knew they couldn't stay in Paris. It was too dangerous. Elodie's network was too powerful, their reach too extensive. They reached the outskirts of the city, the buildings thinning out, replaced by open fields and patches of woodland. The sky above was a canvas of fiery hues, the result of distant explosions, the constant barrage of artillery fire a grim reminder of the ongoing war. "There's a safe house not far from here," Antoine said, pointing towards a cluster of buildings in the distance. "It's used by the resistance. We can rest there, regroup, and plan our next move." They made their way towards the farm, their pace slowing, their bodies exhausted. The air was filled with the scent of smoke and the distant rumble of explosions. The sky above was a breathtaking spectacle of light and color, a terrifying beauty that masked the horrors unfolding on the ground. As they approached the farm, they saw figures moving in the shadows, figures carrying rifles, their faces grim and determined. They were resistance fighters, guarding the safe house, protecting their own. Antoine exchanged a few words with the fighters, a coded phrase that identified them as allies. The fighters, initially suspicious, relaxed their guard and allowed them to enter the farmhouse. The farmhouse was a simple, rustic structure, its interior dimly lit by oil lamps. It was filled with resistance fighters, men and women from all walks of life, united by their common cause, their hatred of the German occupation, their unwavering determination to fight for freedom. Elise and Antoine were given food and water, their wounds tended to. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, the weight of their ordeal heavy on their shoulders. As they sat by the fire, warming themselves, Antoine spoke of his uncle, General Dubois, his voice filled with grief and anger. "He was a good man," Antoine said, his eyes fixed on the flames. "A brave man. He dedicated his life to France, to fighting for what was right. And now he's gone." Elise placed a comforting hand on his arm. "We'll find out what happened to him," she said, her voice firm. "We'll avenge his capture, his death. We won't let Elodie and her allies get away with this." Antoine nodded, his gaze hardening. "We need to get that message to the High Command," he said. "It's our only hope of stopping the German offensive, of saving countless lives." "But how?" Elise asked. "We can't go back to Paris. It's too dangerous. And we don't know who we can trust." Antoine was silent.
He stood, paced,
thinking. "There's one person, one last hope," he said finally. "Someone who can get the information to the right people, someone who has the power and the influence to make a difference. Someone Elodie would never suspect." He revealed it was an old family friend, close to his uncle, Madame Sophie Devereux, residing alone, except for staff, at her country estate. Elise looked at him, her eyes filled with questions. Antoine continued, "She is very wealthy, a patron of the arts, and she has connections to the highest levels of French society. She is above suspicion." Elise felt a spark of new hope. Madame Devereux. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But it was their only chance. "We'll leave at dawn," Antoine declared. The journey was long and dangerous. The next leg had begun, with an unknown destination. Chapter 12. The Unsent Letter. The journey to Madame Devereux's estate was fraught with peril. They traveled by night, avoiding main roads, moving through fields and forests, relying on the help of local resistance fighters who provided them with food, shelter, and guidance. The constant threat of discovery hung over them, a heavy weight on their shoulders. Elise, despite her exhaustion and fear, found a new strength within herself. She was no longer just a nurse, tending to the wounded, a passive observer in the horrors of war. She was an active participant, a key player in a dangerous game of espionage, her actions carrying the weight of lives, of the fate of France. She thought of Lucien, lying in the hospital, his life hanging in the balance. She thought of General Dubois, captured or killed by the enemy. She thought of the countless soldiers and civilians who would die if the German offensive succeeded. Her determination hardened, fueled by her love for Lucien, her grief for General Dubois, her unwavering belief in the cause of freedom. She would not fail. She would not let them down. During a brief respite at a secluded farmhouse, Elise found a quiet moment to herself. She pulled out the small, worn leather pouch that held her most precious possessions, including the few letters Lucien had managed to send her before his supposed death. She opened one of the letters, its edges frayed and softened with repeated readings. She traced the words with her fingertip, his voice echoing in her mind, his love a tangible presence in the desolate landscape. As she reached the end of the letter, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, almost imperceptible fold in the paper, a hidden compartment. She carefully unfolded the paper, revealing a small, handwritten note, tucked away, unseen. The note was brief, a few lines scrawled in Lucien's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Elise, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. I have a secret, a burden I have carried alone. I am not who you think I am. I have done terrible things in the name of duty, in the name of France. I can never tell you the whole truth, but I need you to know that I love you, that I have always loved you, and that everything I have done for you, for our future. There is an unsent letter in my belongings addressed to General Dubois. It contains vital information that must reach him. Find it, Elise, and deliver it. It is my last wish. Yours eternally." Lucien. Elise stared at the note, her heart pounding in her chest. An unsent letter addressed to General Dubois containing vital information. It was another piece of the puzzle, another clue in the labyrinth of secrets and lies. She searched through her belongings, her hands trembling. She found the letter, tucked away in a hidden pocket of Lucien's coat, the one she had taken from the hospital. The envelope was sealed, addressed to General Dubois, in Lucien's handwriting. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the seal. Should she open it? Should she read the contents? It was addressed to General Dubois, not to her. But General Dubois was gone, captured or killed, and Lucien had asked her to deliver it. She made a decision. She carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The contents were shocking, a revelation that changed everything. The letter revealed that Lucien was not just an intelligence officer, he was a double agent, working for both the French and the Germans. He had infiltrated the German intelligence network, gaining their trust, feeding them false information, while secretly gathering vital intelligence for the French. Elodie was not just his contact, she was his handler, his controller. She had been manipulating him, using him, playing him for a fool. But Lucien had discovered her treachery, her plan to betray both sides and seize power for herself. The message in Sainte-Chapelle was not just about the German offensive, it was about Elodie's network, her allies, her collaborators within the French military and government. It was a list of names, a web of deceit and betrayal that reached the highest levels of power. Elise felt a wave of nausea, a sense of profound disillusionment. The world she thought she knew, the lines between good and evil, between friend and foe, were blurred, distorted, almost meaningless. She realized now the true extent of Lucien's sacrifice, the terrible burden he had carried, the constant danger he had faced. He had walked a tightrope between two worlds, risking his life, his sanity, his soul, to protect his country, to protect her. She carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. She knew what she had to do. She had to deliver this letter, along with the deciphered message from Sainte-Chapelle, to Madame Devereux. It was their last hope, their only chance to expose Elodie's network, to prevent the German offensive, to save France. The unsent letter was the key, the final piece of the puzzle, and it weighed heavily in her hands. The truth was a dangerous weapon, and she was about to wield it. Chapter 13. A Glimmer in the Trenches. They reached Madame Devereux's estate under the cover of darkness, the imposing mansion looming before them, a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape. The estate was surrounded by high walls, its gates guarded by armed men, but Antoine, using his resistance contacts, managed to secure them safe passage. Madame Devereux, a woman of striking elegance and formidable presence, greeted them in her grand salon, its walls adorned with priceless works of art, its furnishings reflecting a life of privilege and refinement. She listened intently as Antoine and Elise explained their story, her expression shifting from disbelief to concern to a steely determination. "I knew André General Dubois was involved in something dangerous," she said, her voice firm. "He was a patriot, a true Frenchman. He would never betray his country." Elise handed Madame Devereux the deciphered message from Sainte-Chapelle and the unsent letter from Lucien. Madame Devereux read them carefully, her face paling, her hands trembling slightly. This is extraordinary," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This changes everything. This information, it could save countless lives. It could win us the war." She looked at Elise and Antoine, her eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. "You have both risked your lives to bring me this information," she said. "You are true heroes. And I will not fail you. I will deliver this message to the High Command, to the President himself, if necessary." Madame Devereux revealed that she had a secure line of communication with the highest levels of government, a secret channel used to transmit vital information, bypassing the usual channels, avoiding the risk of interception by the enemy. She immediately set about contacting her contacts, arranging a meeting with a trusted member of the president's inner circle, a man known for his unwavering loyalty and his impeccable discretion. While they waited for confirmation of the meeting, Elise asked Madame Devereux about Lucien. "Is there any news? Any chance of finding out what has happened from his time before the hospital?" Madame Devereux shook her head, sadly. "I've made inquiries, but the situation is chaotic. So many soldiers are missing, wounded, or dead. But there are whispers. I've been looking since Antoine told me he was found. I will not give up hope." Later, as they ate a simple meal in the mansion's grand dining room, a message arrived.
The meeting had been arranged.
Madame Devereux would travel to a secure location the following day, accompanied by Elise and Antoine, to deliver the message in person. As Elise prepared for bed in a luxurious guest room, a stark contrast to the cramped, dirty spaces she had become accustomed to, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Everything was moving too fast, the stakes were too high, the risk of failure too great. She thought of Lucien, lying in the hospital, his fate uncertain. She thought of General Dubois, captured or killed by the enemy. She thought of the countless soldiers and civilians whose lives depended on the success of their mission. She couldn't sleep. She got out of bed and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit grounds of the estate. She saw a figure standing in the shadows, a solitary figure gazing up at the night sky. It was Antoine. She went outside, joining him in the cool night air. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft. She shook her head. "Too much is happening. Too much is at stake." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know. But we're close. We're so close to making a difference, to changing the course of the war." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle rustling of the leaves in the breeze. Then Antoine spoke, his voice hesitant. "Elise, I need to tell you something. Something about Lucien, something I should have told you before." Elise looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it?" "Lucien, he wasn't always a double agent," Antoine said, his voice low. "He started out working solely for the Germans. He was recruited, seduced by Elodie. He believed in their cause, in their ideology." Elise felt a cold wave of shock wash over her. Lucien, a Nazi sympathizer? It was impossible. It couldn't be true. "But he changed," Antoine continued, his voice urgent. "He realized the truth, the evil of their regime, the horrors they were inflicting. He turned against them, becoming a double agent, risking his life to atone for his mistakes, to fight for what was right." Why didn't you tell me this before?" Elise asked, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to hurt you," Antoine said. "I didn't want to shatter your image of him. But you deserve to know the truth. The whole truth." He continued. He knew the risks. He was ready to die, even before he found out Elodie was a traitor. He knew it was all catching up. Elise felt a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a profound sadness. Lucien, her Lucien, had lived a lie, had deceived her, had betrayed his country, even if he had ultimately redeemed himself. "He loved you," Elise, Antoine said, his voice gentle. "He truly loved you. That's what changed him. That's what made him turn against the Germans, against Elodie. You were his redemption. You were his hope. The glimmer was there." Lucien had fought his own demons, and love was the light. The war within him had been as fierce as the one raging around them. Chapter 14. The Price of Freedom. The meeting with the president's envoy took place in a secluded hunting lodge, deep in the forest, far from the prying eyes of the enemy. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation and apprehension. Madame Devereux, accompanied by Elise and Antoine, presented the evidence, the deciphered message from Sainte-Chapelle and Lucien's unsent letter. The envoy, a stern-faced man with sharp, intelligent eyes, listened intently, his expression shifting from skepticism to astonishment to a grim determination. He examined the documents carefully, questioning Elise and Antoine about their journey, their discoveries, their encounters. "This information, it's damning," he said finally, his voice grave. "It confirms our worst fears. Elodie's network is far more extensive than we imagined. It reaches into the highest levels of our government, our military." He looked at Madame Devereux, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You have done a great service to France, madame," he said. "You have all done a great service. You have risked your lives to bring us this information, and we will not forget it." He assured them that immediate action would be taken. The individuals named in the message and the letter would be arrested, interrogated, and brought to justice. The planned German offensive would be countered, the French defenses reinforced, the tide of the war turned. Elise felt a surge of relief, a sense of accomplishment. They had done it. They had succeeded in their mission. They had delivered the message, exposed the traitors, and perhaps saved France from imminent defeat. But her relief was short-lived. As they were leaving the hunting lodge, a detachment of soldiers arrived, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. They were not French soldiers. They were German. The envoy's face turned ashen. "Betrayal," he whispered. "We've been betrayed." A firefight erupted, the quiet of the forest shattered by the roar of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, the chaos of battle. Elise, Antoine, and Madame Devereux found themselves caught in the crossfire, trapped between the German soldiers and the envoy's small security detail. Antoine pushed Elise behind a tree, shielding her with his body. "Stay down," he shouted, his voice barely audible above the din of battle. "Don't move." He drew his own weapon, a small pistol he had concealed beneath his coat, and returned fire, his movements quick and precise, honed by years of experience in the resistance. Elise watched in horror as the battle raged around them. The envoy's security detail was quickly overwhelmed, outnumbered and outgunned by the German soldiers. The envoy himself was shot, collapsing to the ground, his body riddled with bullets. Madame Devereux, despite her age and her elegant demeanor, fought bravely, using a small pistol she had concealed in her purse, her aim surprisingly accurate. Elise, armed only with her wits and her determination, did what she could to help, tending to the wounded, providing cover, using her knowledge of first aid to save lives. The battle was fierce and brutal, a desperate struggle for survival. But it was a losing battle. The German soldiers were too many, too well-armed, too determined. Antoine was shot, a bullet piercing his shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground. Elise rushed to his side, her heart pounding in her chest.
Antoine,
She cried, her voice choked with fear. Are you all right? He grimaced in pain, his face pale. I'll live, he said, his voice weak. But we need to get out of here. We need to escape. Madame Devereux, seeing their plight, created a diversion, drawing the German soldiers' fire, allowing Elise and Antoine to slip away, to disappear into the dense forest. They ran, their lungs burning, their legs aching, the sound of gunfire fading behind them. They didn't stop running until they were far from the hunting lodge, far from the carnage, far from the betrayal that had cost so many lives. The price of freedom was steep, and they had paid dearly for it. The escape was a victory, but a hollow one, overshadowed by loss and the knowledge that the fight was far from over. Chapter 15. Beyond the barbed wire. They found refuge in a small, abandoned shepherd's hut, hidden deep in the forest. Antoine's wound was bleeding heavily, and Elise did her best to tend to it, using strips of cloth torn from her dress as bandages. He was weak and feverish, but his spirit remained unbroken. We need to get to a doctor, Elise said, her voice filled with concern. You need proper medical attention. Antoine shook his head.
no hospitals.
No doctors. They'll be looking for us. We're safer here. Elise knew he was right. They were fugitives, hunted by both the Germans and Elodie's network. They couldn't trust anyone. They spent the next few days hiding in the hut, rationing their meager supplies, living in constant fear of discovery. Elise cared for Antoine as best she could, her nursing skills proving invaluable in his recovery. As Antoine's strength slowly returned, they discussed their options. They knew they couldn't stay in hiding forever. They needed to find a way to reach safety, to expose Elodie's network, to ensure that the information they had risked their lives to obtain reached the right people. There's one place, one last hope, Antoine said, his voice weak but determined. A prisoner of war camp near the Swiss border. It's run by the Germans, but there's a resistance cell operating within the camp. They help prisoners escape, smuggle information across the border. Elise looked at him, her eyes filled with apprehension. A prisoner of war camp? It's too dangerous. We'll be captured, killed. It's our only chance, Antoine said. We need to get to Switzerland, to neutral territory. From there, we can contact the Allied forces, deliver the information, expose Elodie's treachery. He explained that the resistance cell within the camp had a network of contacts, a secret tunnel that led beyond the barbed wire, a path to freedom. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble, but it was their only option. They set out the following day, traveling by night, avoiding main roads, relying on the help of local farmers and villagers who were sympathetic to the resistance cause. The journey was arduous, their bodies exhausted, their spirits tested to the limit. They finally reached the outskirts of the prisoner of war camp, a bleak, desolate landscape of barbed wire, watchtowers, and armed guards. The air was filled with the sounds of suffering, the cries of the prisoners, the barking of dogs. Antoine, using his resistance contacts, managed to make contact with a member of the camp's underground network, a prisoner who worked in the camp's kitchen, a man known only as Le Renard the Fox. Le Renard arranged for them to be smuggled into the camp, disguised as prisoners, their identities concealed, their mission a closely guarded secret. Elise and Antoine were separated, assigned to different barracks, their contact limited, their communication risky. The camp was a brutal, dehumanizing place, where prisoners were treated like animals, subjected to starvation, disease, and constant abuse. Elise, using her nursing skills, managed to secure a position in the camp's infirmary, a small, poorly equipped facility where she tended to the sick and injured prisoners, her heart aching for their suffering. She witnessed firsthand the horrors of the camp, the cruelty of the guards, the desperation of the prisoners. She saw men die from starvation, from disease, from beatings, their spirits broken, their hope extinguished. But she also witnessed acts of courage, of resilience, of defiance. She saw prisoners sharing their meager rations, comforting each other, helping each other to survive. She saw the spirit of resistance burning brightly, even in the darkest of places. She learned that Le Renard was planning an escape, a daring attempt to smuggle a group of prisoners, including herself and Antoine, across the border to Switzerland. The escape was scheduled for the following week, a moonless night, a window of opportunity that might never come again. Elise waited, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She knew the risks were enormous, the chances of success slim.
But she also knew that she had to try.
She had to escape, to reach safety, to deliver the message, to honor the sacrifices of Lucien, of General Dubois, of all those who had fought and died for freedom. The barbed wire was a symbol of oppression, but beyond it lay hope, a chance for a new beginning, a chance to finally win the war within and the war without. Chapter 16. The Soldier's Promise. The night of the escape was moonless, the sky a blanket of inky blackness. The air was cold and crisp, the silence broken only by the distant barking of dogs and the occasional shout of a guard. Elise, her heart pounding in her chest, waited in the shadows near the infirmary, her senses on high alert. She had managed to see Antoine earlier that day, a brief, whispered conversation during which they confirmed the plan. Le Renard had arranged for them to meet near the perimeter fence, at a section where the barbed wire had been secretly cut, a narrow opening that led to freedom. At the appointed hour, Elise slipped out of the infirmary, moving silently through the darkened camp, avoiding the watchtowers, the patrols, the ever-present threat of discovery. She reached the perimeter fence, her breath held, her body tense. Antoine was already there, waiting for her, his face a pale mask in the darkness. He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Ready?" he whispered. She nodded, her voice caught in her throat. They waited, their eyes fixed on the shadows, listening for any sign of Le Renard, any indication that the escape was underway. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes and a determined expression. It was Le Renard. "Now," he whispered, his voice urgent. "Follow me." He led them to a section of the fence where the barbed wire had been carefully cut, creating a narrow opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. One by one, a small group of prisoners, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and hope, slipped through the opening, disappearing into the darkness beyond the camp. Elise and Antoine were among the last to go. As Elise squeezed through the narrow opening, she felt a sharp pain in her arm, a strand of barbed wire catching on her sleeve, tearing her flesh. She stifled a cry, her eyes watering, her determination unwavering. They were free. They had escaped the confines of the camp, the horrors of imprisonment, the constant threat of death. They were beyond the barbed wire, in the no-man's land between captivity and freedom. Le Renard led them through a dense forest, moving quickly and silently, avoiding the patrols, the searchlights, the ever-present danger of recapture. As they walked, Elise tended to her injured arm, using a strip of cloth torn from her dress to staunch the bleeding. The pain was intense, but she ignored it, her focus on reaching safety, on completing their mission. They reached a small, secluded farmhouse, a safe house used by the resistance, where they were greeted by a group of armed fighters, their faces grim but welcoming. They were given food and water, their wounds tended to. They were safe for the moment, but they knew they couldn't stay long. They had to reach Switzerland, to cross the border, to deliver the message. Le Renard explained that the border was heavily guarded, the patrols frequent and vigilant. But he had a plan. He had arranged for a local farmer, a sympathizer to the resistance, to smuggle them across the border in his cart, hidden beneath a load of hay. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. They set out the following night, the cart rumbling along a bumpy dirt road, the air thick with tension and anticipation. As they neared the border, they saw the lights of the Swiss guard posts, the figures of the soldiers silhouetted against the night sky. Elise held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The farmer stopped the cart a short distance from the border, his face pale with fear. He spoke in hushed tones to Lou Renard, explaining that the patrols had been intensified, the security heightened. Lou Renard listened intently, his expression grim. He turned to Elise and Antoine. "It's too dangerous," he said, his voice low. "We can't risk it. They'll search the cart, find us, and shoot us." Elise felt the wave of despair wash over her. They had come so far, risked so much, only to be stopped at the final hurdle. But then, Antoine spoke, his voice firm and determined. "There's another way. A soldier's promise." He explained a daring, almost suicidal plan. He would create a diversion, drawing the attention of the border guards, allowing Elise and Le Renard to slip across the border unnoticed. "It's too dangerous," Elise protested. "You'll be killed." "It's the only way," Antoine said, his eyes fixed on hers. "I made a promise to Lucien to get you to safety to deliver the message. I won't break that promise." He turned to Le Renard. "Take her. Get her across the border. It's up to you now." Before Elise could argue, Antoine slipped away, disappearing into the darkness. She heard a shout, a gunshot, the sound of running feet. Antoine had created his diversion. It was now or never. The soldier's promise was his life, his sacrifice, his final act of defiance. And it was her chance to complete their mission. Chapter 17. Whispers of the Missing. Le Renard, his face grim, pulled Elise along, urging her to move quickly, silently. They ran through the darkness, the sounds of the commotion at the border fading behind them. Antoine's sacrifice had bought them precious time, a window of opportunity that might never come again. They reached a section of the border where the fence was less heavily guarded, a small, almost imperceptible gap in the wire, a secret passage known only to the resistance. Le Renard helped Elise through the gap, his movements quick and efficient. They were in Switzerland. They had made it. They were safe. But their relief was tempered by the knowledge of Antoine's sacrifice, the uncertainty of his fate. Elise felt a crushing weight of guilt, a sense of responsibility for his actions. He had given his life, perhaps, to save hers, to ensure the success of their mission. They found refuge in a small village near the border, a haven for refugees and resistance fighters. Le Renard, using his contacts, arranged for them to be taken to Geneva, the headquarters of the International Red Cross, a neutral ground where they could contact the Allied forces and deliver the message. In Geneva, Elise was finally able to receive proper medical attention for her injured arm, the wound cleaned and bandaged, the pain slowly subsiding. She was given a room in a small, discreet hotel, a safe haven where she could rest and recover. But she couldn't rest. She couldn't shake the image of Antoine, disappearing into the darkness, the sound of gunfire echoing in her ears. She had to know what had happened to him. She sought out Le Renard, pleading with him to help her find out Antoine's fate. Le Renard, initially reluctant, finally agreed to make inquiries, to use his network of contacts to gather information. The news was slow in coming, the situation at the border chaotic, the information fragmented and unreliable. But finally, Le Renard returned with news, his expression somber. "Antoine, he was captured," Le Renard said, his voice low. "He was shot, but he survived. He's being held prisoner by the Germans." Elise felt a mixture of relief and despair. He was alive, but he was in the hands of the enemy, his fate uncertain. "We have to rescue him," Elise said, her voice firm. "We can't leave him there." Le Renard shook his head. "It's too dangerous. The border is heavily guarded. The Germans are on high alert. It's impossible." Elise refused to accept defeat. She knew she couldn't abandon Antoine. She owed him her life, her freedom. She had to find a way to save him. She spent the next few days contacting various organizations, pleading for help, seeking assistance from the Red Cross, the Allied forces, anyone who could help her rescue Antoine. But her efforts were met with resistance, with bureaucratic obstacles, with the cold reality of wartime priorities. Antoine was just one prisoner, one among thousands, his rescue a low priority in the grand scheme of the war. Elise felt a growing sense of frustration, a desperate need to act, to do something, anything, to save Antoine. Then, she received a message, a cryptic note delivered by a young boy, a member of the resistance. The note was unsigned, but she recognized the handwriting. It was from Madame Devereux. The note contained a single sentence: "The whispers of the missing can be heard in unexpected places." Elise pondered the message, her mind racing. The whispers of the missing unexpected places, what did it mean? Where should she look? Then it came to her. The hospital.
Lucien.
He was still alive, still recovering from his wounds. He might know something. He might have contacts, information, a way to help Antoine. She decided to take a risk, a desperate gamble. She would return to France, to the hospital in Arras, to see Lucien. It was a dangerous journey, a return to the heart of enemy territory, but she had no choice.
She had to try.
The whispers of the missing were calling her back, to the place where it all began, to the man she loved, to the hope of saving Antoine. The journey back was a leap of faith, a return to danger, and a testament to her unwavering determination. Chapter 18. The Reckoning at Reims. The journey back to France was a perilous undertaking, a clandestine crossing of borders, a reliance on the shadowy network of the resistance. Elise, disguised as a Red Cross worker, traveled by night, avoiding main roads, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She finally reached Arras, the city bearing the scars of war, its streets patrolled by German soldiers, its citizens living in fear and uncertainty. The hospital, though damaged, was still functioning, a haven for the wounded, a place of hope and despair. Elise, using her Red Cross credentials, managed to gain access to the hospital, her heart pounding in her chest. She found her way to the ward where Lucien was recovering, her senses on high alert, her every movement cautious and deliberate. She found him lying in his bed, his face pale and gaunt, but his eyes filled with a familiar spark of recognition. He was weak, but he was alive. "Elise," he whispered, his voice raspy. "You came back." She knelt beside his bed, taking his hand in hers. "I had to see you, Lucien. I had to know you were all right." She told him everything. She told him about Antoine's sacrifice, about his capture, about her desperate attempt to rescue him. She told him about the message, about Madame Devereux, about the exposure of Elodie's network. Lucien listened intently, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, pride, sadness, gratitude, and a flicker of hope. "Antoine's a good man," Lucien said, his voice weak. "A brave man. We have to save him." He revealed that he had contacts within the German military, officers who were secretly opposed to the Nazi regime, men who were willing to help, to provide information, to assist in a rescue attempt. "There's a German officer, Colonel Schmidt, stationed in Reims," Lucien said. "He's a member of the resistance. He can help us. He has access to information, to resources, to the prison where Antoine is being held." Reims. The city of coronations, a place of historical significance, now under German occupation, a stronghold of enemy power. It was a dangerous place, a risky destination, but it was their only hope. Elise, with Lucien's guidance, contacted Colonel Schmidt, using a coded message delivered through the resistance network. The colonel agreed to meet with her, to discuss a plan to rescue Antoine. The meeting took place in a small, abandoned church on the outskirts of Reims, a place of sanctuary and secrecy. Colonel Schmidt, a tall, imposing man with a stern face and intelligent eyes, listened carefully as Elise explained the situation, her voice filled with urgency and determination. "Antoine Dubois, he's a valuable asset," Colonel Schmidt said, his voice low and guarded. "He knows too much. The Gestapo will be interrogating him, torturing him, trying to extract information. We have to get him out. And soon." He outlined a daring plan, a coordinated effort involving resistance fighters, sympathetic German soldiers, and a network of informants within the prison where Antoine was being held. The plan was complex, risky, and dependent on perfect timing and flawless execution. The rescue attempt was scheduled for the following week, a moonless night, a window of opportunity that might never come again. Elise, despite her fear, insisted on participating, on being a part of the operation. "I can't just stand by and wait," she said. "I have to do something. I owe it to Antoine. I owe it to Lucien." Colonel Schmidt, initially reluctant, finally agreed to allow her to participate, assigning her a crucial role in the operation. She would act as a decoy, drawing the attention of the guards, creating a diversion that would allow the rescue team to infiltrate the prison. The night of the reckoning arrived, a night of tension, of anticipation, of fear. Elise, dressed in a German nurse's uniform, her heart pounding in her chest, played her part, creating a commotion near the prison entrance, drawing the guards away from their posts, creating a window of opportunity for the rescue team. The operation was a success. Antoine was rescued, smuggled out of the prison, transported to a safe house, his injuries treated, his spirit unbroken. But the victory was not without cost. Several resistance fighters were killed, their lives sacrificed in the pursuit of freedom. Colonel Schmidt was exposed, arrested by the Gestapo, his fate uncertain. The reckoning at Reims was a turning point, a moment of triumph and tragedy, a testament to the courage and resilience of those who fought against the darkness of oppression. It was a victory for Elise, for Lucien, for Antoine, for the resistance, but it was a victory tinged with sadness, with the knowledge of the sacrifices made, the lives lost. The final battle was still ahead. But the tide was turning. Chapter 19. A Love Forged in Fire. With Antoine rescued, the focus shifted to getting him and the crucial intelligence he possessed to safety. The resistance network, though battered by recent losses, rallied, arranging for them to be smuggled across the border into Switzerland, a haven from the immediate dangers of occupied France. The journey was arduous, a constant cat and mouse game with German patrols, a reliance on the bravery and resourcefulness of their resistance guides. Elise, her nursing skills honed by months of wartime experience, tended to Antoine's wounds, ensuring his fragile health wouldn't fail him before they reached safety. They finally crossed the border, the relief palpable, a weight lifted from their shoulders. In Switzerland, they were met by representatives of the Allied forces, eager to debrief Antoine, to utilize the intelligence he had gathered at such great personal cost. Elise, no longer a fugitive, was able to send word to Lucien, informing him of Antoine's rescue, of their safe arrival in Switzerland. She longed to return to him, to be by his side, but she knew she couldn't. Her role in the resistance, her knowledge of their operations, made her a target. She had to remain in Switzerland, for her own safety and for Lucien's. The Allied forces, armed with the information provided by Lucien, Antoine, and Madame Devereux, launched a series of counteroffensives, targeting Elodie's network, disrupting German supply lines, and ultimately, turning the tide of the war. Elodie herself was captured, her treachery exposed, her reign of terror brought to an end. Elise, though separated from Lucien, found purpose in working with the Red Cross in Switzerland, assisting refugees, tending to the wounded, using her skills to alleviate the suffering caused by the war. She kept in contact with Lucien through coded messages, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness of their separation. Months passed, the war raging on, the outcome still uncertain. Then, finally, the news arrived. The Allies had landed in Normandy, the liberation of France had begun. Elise felt a surge of hope, a sense of anticipation. The end was in sight. The war would soon be over. She would be reunited with Lucien. The Allied forces advanced rapidly, pushing the German army back, liberating towns and cities, freeing the French people from the yoke of occupation. Paris was liberated, the streets filled with cheering crowds, the air ringing with the sounds of celebration. Elise, along with countless other refugees, returned to France, her heart filled with a mixture of joy and trepidation. She traveled to Arras, to the hospital, to the place where her journey had begun, to the man she loved. She found him in his bed, his face still pale, but his eyes shining with a light that had been absent for too long. He was recovering, slowly but surely, his strength returning. "Elise," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "You're home." She knelt beside his bed, taking his hand in hers, tears streaming down her face. "I'm home, Lucien. I'm finally home." They embraced, a long, tender embrace that spoke of love, of loss, of resilience, of a future finally within their grasp. The war had tested them, broken them, scarred them, but it had also forged a bond between them, a love that had endured the fires of conflict, a love that would last a lifetime. The war was not yet over, but the end was near. They had survived. They had triumphed. They had found their way back to each other. And that was all that mattered. Their love story, born in the whispers of the trenches, had blossomed amidst the ruins of war, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. It was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild their lives, to heal their wounds, to create a future filled with hope and love. The fire had forged them, and they were stronger than ever. Chapter 20. Dawn After the Darkness. The final days of the war were a blur of activity, of liberation, of celebration, of mourning. The Allied forces swept across Europe, crushing the remnants of the German army, bringing an end to the long, brutal conflict. Lucien, his health steadily improving, was transferred to a military hospital in Paris, where he continued his recovery, surrounded by fellow soldiers, by the sounds of a nation rebuilding itself. Elise, working with the Red Cross, assisted in the efforts to reunite families, to care for the wounded, to rebuild the shattered lives of those affected by the war. The official announcement of Germany's surrender was met with a wave of euphoria, of relief, of disbelief. The war was over. The nightmare had ended. France was free. Elise and Lucien, finally reunited, spent their days together, rediscovering each other, healing the wounds of their separation, making plans for a future they had almost lost. They walked hand in hand through the streets of Paris, the city reborn, vibrant with life, its scars slowly fading. They visited Sainte-Chapelle, the place where their journey had taken a dramatic turn, the place where Lucien's secret had been hidden in plain sight. They gazed up at the rose window, its stained glass shimmering in the sunlight, a reminder of the darkness they had endured and the light that had ultimately prevailed. They traveled to the countryside, to the small village where Lucien had grown up, a place of peace and tranquility, far from the horrors of the war. They visited his family, his mother, his siblings, who welcomed Elise with open arms, their hearts filled with gratitude for her bravery, for her unwavering love for Lucien. Lucien, fully recovered, was discharged from the military, his service to his country honored and recognized. He and Elise decided to settle in the village, to build a life together, to create a family, to embrace the simple joys of peace and normalcy. They found a small cottage, nestled amidst rolling hills and fields of wildflowers, a place where they could heal, where they could rebuild, where they could finally be together. They planted a garden, filled with roses and poppies, a symbol of their love, a reminder of the sacrifices they had made. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their cottage, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold, Lucien took Elise's hand in his eyes filled with love and gratitude. "We made it, Elise," he said, his voice soft. "We survived. We're together. And we have a future." Elise leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart overflowing with happiness. "We did, Lucien," she said. "We faced the darkness, and we found our way to the dawn." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle breeze rustling through the leaves, the distant chirping of crickets. The war had left its mark on them, scars that would never fully heal, but it had also strengthened them, forged a bond between them that could never be broken. They had found love in the midst of chaos, hope in the face of despair, and strength in the depths of their own hearts. They had endured the trials of war, the betrayals, the sacrifices, the losses, and they had emerged victorious, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The dawn had broken, and their future stretched before them, bright and full of promise. It was a new beginning, a time for healing, for rebuilding, for living.
Epilogue.
Years passed, the seasons turning, the scars of war slowly fading, replaced by the gentle rhythms of peace and normalcy. Elise and Lucien built a life together in their small cottage, their love a constant presence, a source of strength and comfort. They raised a family, 2 children, a boy and a girl, who filled their lives with laughter, with joy, with the boundless energy of youth. They taught their children about the war, about the sacrifices that had been made, about the importance of freedom, of love, of resilience. They never forgot those they had lost, the friends, the comrades, the family members who had perished in the conflict. They honored their memory, keeping their stories alive, ensuring that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. Antoine, after a long and difficult recovery, returned to France a hero, his bravery recognized and celebrated. He remained close to Elise and Lucien, a bond forged in the crucible of war, a friendship that would last a lifetime. Madame Devereux, her role in the resistance revealed, was hailed as a national heroine, her courage and her unwavering commitment to France inspiring a generation. Lucien, though haunted by the memories of his past, found solace in his family, in his work as a carpenter, in the simple joys of everyday life. He never fully escaped the shadows of the war, but he learned to live with them, to find peace in the present, to embrace the future. Elise, her nursing skills still in demand, worked at the local village clinic, tending to the sick and injured, her compassion and her dedication unwavering. She found fulfillment in helping others, in making a difference in her community, in giving back to the world that had given her so much. One spring morning, many years after the war had ended, Elise and Lucien, their hair now streaked with silver, their faces lined with the wisdom of age, walked hand in hand through their garden, the roses and poppies in full bloom, their fragrance filling the air. They stopped by a small, stone memorial, a tribute to those who had lost their lives in the war, their names etched in the stone, a constant reminder of the price of freedom. Lucien placed a single red poppy on the memorial, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "We were so lucky, Elise," he said, his voice soft. "We found each other. We survived. We built a life together. So many others didn't." Elise nodded, her own eyes misting with tears. "We were blessed, Lucien," she said, "but we also fought for it. We fought for our love, for our freedom, for our future." They stood in silence for a moment, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with love and remembrance. The war had shaped them, changed them, but it had not broken them. They had endured, they had triumphed, and they had found their way to a life of peace, of happiness, of enduring love. The whispers of the trenches had faded, replaced by the gentle sounds of birdsong, the laughter of their grandchildren, the quiet contentment of a life well lived. The dawn had truly arrived.